remember that it's a lot of what my dad likes to do is just try to figure out why these weird passages in the Bible and what God has to teach us in them. So let me go ahead and share my slides here. So the passage I want to talk about is Genesis 47, and I want to think with you a little bit about how it connects to systemic evil. And before I jump in, let me just say I am a biblical scholar, as Darren mentioned. So I'm coming into this with certain tools for exploring this passage, but also very aware of the need for practical wisdom and expertise in other fields for applying biblical wisdom to life. So I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a political philosopher, and so once I introduce this passage a little bit, I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say, what your input is from the various kinds of giftings and perspectives God has given you. But I'm just going to try to start us off with this passage here and think about how it might apply. Kind of to set some context for this, there's been a lot of debate in the Christian community about the definition of justice, and it's kind of what got me thinking on this track and thinking towards this passage. And some of that's connected to issues of racial justice and various other kinds of things. I'm not going to be jumping and parachuting into the details of specific issues, but one of the things that this kind of debate has made me think about is the need for thinking about what the Bible has to say about justice. And a couple of, but let me just throw a couple of categories out there for what we might be thinking about before we jump to our passage. First of all, there's a debate about individual versus corporate evil. Is evil something primarily that works on the individual level, or is it something that also has a corporate dimension? And here we have debates like, there's that Bible passage where the prophet Ezekiel says that the son shall not die for his father's sins. And there's Jesus saying evil comes out of the heart, and in some circles that might justify a focus only on the individual. It certainly makes us think that the individual is an important part of it. On the other hand, there are other Bible passages that certainly does make it seem like there's some connection between parents and children's sins, and there's people confessing for corporate sin as well. So there's a debate there. We could distinguish intentional versus consequential evil. To what extent is evil primarily about something that you know about and do intentionally, or to what extent is evil something that you could have the best of intentions, but the consequences turn out to be badly? And here as well, I think we find actually Bible passages that seem to stack up on either side. Certainly, the idea of what's going on with your heart, your will, your intentions is very important in the Bible. On the other hand, there are big Old Testament categories of unintentional sin. It's not on the same level as like high-handed intentional sin, but there's a specific place for it in that economy of Leviticus as a kind of sin that needs to be dealt with. And I think we have debates about how much is evil do we focus on just like into the intentional, and how much we focus on consequences that might be unintentional. And then finally, like strictly present age or versus historical focus. To what extent is it helpful to look back at the like historical sweep of which might provide a context for evil, and to what extent should we let the past be the past and focus on the present? And again, I think you can go to different Bible passages. Certainly there are some, like when Daniel confesses not just for his sins but his father's sins and things like that seem to think there might be a historical focus. I just tossed up two figures on either end of the spectrum here, kind of as placeholders. I on all three of these, I kind of put marks all the way on the corporate, consequential, historical end, and I just put Kant all the way on the individual, intentional, strictly present end. We could put other figures there, but I actually mostly just have them as points at the end to make the point that there's a lot of room in the middle for how we would think about justice, how we would think about evil on any of these. If there's something to both sides of this, where would we put the balance? That's the way I want to just frame the question. And I've just dug up a bunch of scripture texts that I'm not going to like solve for you. And that's partially, when an academic like me says, well, we don't have time to solve that here, that just means we don't know the answer yet. And we're just gesturing to the fact that there's that problem out there. But one passage that I don't really see come up in these kinds of discussions is Genesis 47. And it's a passage that every time I read it, I think this must have something to say about these kinds of debates. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at this passage, I want to give you a little context, and then try to figure out what exactly does this passage have to say for thinking about the nature of evil, and how it functions and how we should respond to it as Christians. That went back. But that is there's a nice picture there. That's the tomb of Senedrim, by the way, a wonderful Egyptian agricultural scene. And since our passage is all about Egyptian agriculture, I thought it would be a fun picture to start out with. Okay, so let's get to the story. I've started with the verse that kind of segues us into the story. And Joseph provided bread for his father and his brothers and all the house of his father, according to the number of the little children. So I don't know if you remember the story of Joseph. The basic highlights are, Joseph is a child of Jacob. Jacob has 12 children, and he has 2 wives, which makes it complicated because he liked one of the wives better, and Joseph is the child of that wife. So Joseph is consequently one of his favorite children, and there's some sibling rivalry. His brothers end up throwing him down a pit and then selling him into slavery and telling his father he's dead. A quite rough start for poor Joseph. Joseph ends up in slavery in Egypt, but through God's providence and faithfulness, he's given this ability to interpret dreams. The wisdom of God helping him realize what these dreams are about, and that raises him to a high level in the kingdom. And the crisis that really triggers his rise is that Pharaoh has this dream. It's a very alarming dream, and none of his dream interpreters can tell him what it's about. It's kind of similar to Daniel's story, but Joseph can. And Joseph tells him that the point of the dream is there's going to be 7 years of really, really good crop yields, and then there's going to be 7 years of deadly famine. And if Pharaoh wants his kingdom to survive, what he's going to have to do is collect all of the surplus grain in the 7 years and then use it to survive during the 7 years of famine. And Joseph says, you should probably put somebody in charge of that. And Pharaoh says, I bet I know who would be a good person. I'll make you in charge of that, Joseph. And Joseph goes from being in prison to being elevated to vizier, second to Pharaoh, riding in Pharaoh's chariot, absolutely at the top of the kingdom. And that may be the wrong verse reference. I'm sorry, I may have not changed it. It should be 12. It should be 47:12. My bad. So not 47:27, 47:12. With all of this, Joseph's brothers end up, there's a famine in Canaan. Joseph's brothers end up coming looking for grain, and they don't know they're talking to Joseph. Joseph plays some mind games with them before ultimately revealing who he is, and they reconcile. And then Joseph brings his whole family down into Egypt in order to save them from the famine. So far, kind of a common story you would hear maybe in Veggie Tales or the cartoon version of Joseph, or just even the things we remember when we think about the story. And then as you get towards the end of Genesis, there are some things that are just less memorable and passages we forget about, and this is one of them. And so this one ends kind of where we're used to the story, with Joseph providing for his family. I think it's very significant. Joseph provides bread for his whole family, even the little children. It's an interesting framing, and it's actually where we're going to end the passage as well. Just the narrator wants us to be sure to know Joseph's family has plenty to eat, and he's made sure about that. Okay. So let's jump in here to the story itself. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very heavy, and the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were distraught from before the famine. And Joseph collected all the silver to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain which they were buying. And Joseph brought the silver into the house of Pharaoh. And there was no more silver in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan. And all Egypt came to Joseph, saying, Give to us bread. Why should we die in front of you? For the silver is gone. And Joseph said, Give your livestock, and I will give to you in exchange for your livestock if the silver is gone. And they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave bread in exchange for horses and sheep and cattle and donkeys, and he supplied them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. So people of Egypt are starving, and they run out of money, and so Joseph's like, okay, you can bring your livestock. It continues. When that year was over, they came to him in the second year and said to him, We cannot hide from my lord that the silver is gone, and the livestock and the animals belong to my lord. Nothing is left before my lord except for our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for bread. Oh, sorry. There we go. Buy us and our land in exchange for bread, and we and our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. So give seed that we might live and not die, and that the land might not be devastated. So they come with this proposal. We don't have anything else to give, but buy us and buy our land. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold themselves, each one his field, for the famine was strong against them. So the land became Pharaoh's possession. As for the people, he enslaved them from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for there was a statute of Pharaoh for the priests, that they shall eat their portion by statute which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. And Joseph said to the people, look, I have bought you today and your land for Pharaoh. Here is seed for you that you may sow the land. And it shall be that when you harvest your produce, then you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and the other 4 parts will belong to you for the seed of the field, and for you to eat, and for those in your house, and for your little children to eat. Notice the parallel there, that when we talked about Joseph's family being taken care of, they explicitly mentioned that little children have enough to eat. And here again, well, the little children have enough to eat, but perhaps in a slightly different situation. And they said, you have given us life. We have found favor in your eyes, my lord, and we shall be slaves to Pharaoh. And Joseph said it is a statute to this day over the land of Egypt. 1/5 belongs to Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's possession. And then we have the verse that transitions us onto the next story. And Israel dwelled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and they bore fruit, and they multiplied greatly. Don't miss the specific statement that Israel dwelled, not just dwelled, but acquired property in the land of Egypt. It seems that other than Pharaoh and the temples, they might be the only people who actually own property in the land of Egypt at this point, based on the way the story is showing things. So first, to justify the Egyptian part of Semitic and Egyptian languages and literatures department, as Darren mentioned earlier, I thought, it says that Joseph sets this up, and this is the kind of statute in Egypt going forward. It would be fun to kind of like dig into some of the context of that. Can we find anything actually in Egypt that lines up with this? I found something, Papyrus Wilbur, one kind of the chief Egyptian tax documents from this period. It's obviously, I think, probably from a few centuries at least after Joseph. We don't really know when to date Joseph, but Ramses V, 1142 BC, after the Exodus, I think, is how we date it. So significantly after Joseph. But I think it gives us a picture of actually kind of the ideology that's being described in Genesis 47. So, and we find different, this is a document, is actually, I've got a picture of like 3 columns here, but this is like 100 columns long. It's a long document. And it lists a bunch of different plots of land and who they belong to and the rate and the tax that they have on them. So some of them are called apportioning domains. These are basically people who have more control over their land. So they're mostly military occupations, and they're probably royal grants. So these are probably people who, so many of them are in the military, we think probably people who it was in the king's interest to give them land at a cheap price in order to kind of maintain the power structure of Egypt. And they're taxed at a really reasonable rate at about 4% of their produce. But notice their land is granted to them by the king, and maybe even hereditary, maybe even their children can inherit it. It would seem their children can inherit it, but nevertheless, it's coming from the king. Then we find non-apportioning domains, which we that's how the manuscript titles them, which are worked by cultivators, and these are taxed at 30% of produce. So this is actually more than even we saw in Genesis 47, the like 1/5 tax. Here we have a 30% tax of produce. And then finally, we have land administered directly by the state. So as it turns out, this picture of this as kind of a lasting idea in Egypt really does kind of ramify through the centuries, really all the way to the Ptolemaic period. The idea that all of the land is at least notionally owned by Pharaoh, and he may have different tiers of people who are on that land, but it's ultimately a gift from Pharaoh, they're paying taxes to Pharaoh. And it's not really till the Roman period when that changes. So we get a picture of this like tax regime, like, and who knows if we're in a wider historical perspective, where we put Joseph's part in that. There was definitely royal power and taxation long before Joseph came on the scene, but the biblical story credits Joseph quite a bit with the system of taxation and all of the land belonging to Pharaoh. Well, what should we think about that? Commentators think different things. Let me give you a few commentator opinions. This is Nahum Sarna. Joseph's actions cannot be measured by the moral standards that the Hebrew Bible, especially the prophetic tradition, inculcated in Western civilization. Rather, they must be judged in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world, by whose norms Joseph emerges here as a highly admirable model of a shrewd and successful administrator. Nonetheless, a moral judgment on the situation is subtly introduced into the narrative by shifting the onus of responsibility for the fate of the peasants from Joseph to the Egyptians themselves. The peasants initiate the idea of their own enslavement and even express gratitude when it is implemented. So there you go. Kind of sounds like for Sarna, it's really the Egyptians' fault for selling themselves into slavery. Here's Victor Hamilton. In some similar vein, Joseph is not a callous, unethical taskmaster. True, the people forfeit ownership of their land to Pharaoh, but Joseph allows them, when this measure can be put into practice, to keep 80% of the harvest for themselves. Only 20% remains Pharaoh's. CF to 10%, that is Yahweh's in OT religion. And that's still twice as much as what God requires as tithe from his people, but okay. The people are evidently grateful for this arrangement, for they say to Joseph, "You have rescued our lives." Joseph is the non-discriminating savior. His concern for Egyptians is no less than his concern for his own family. I have serious doubt about that. I think Joseph's family gets off a lot better than the Egyptians in this story, but nevertheless. And apparently Joseph's reforms were acceptable to later Egyptians as well, or at least to later pharaohs. Not a small qualification there. The pharaohs like this, apparently. Joseph's decree was still a law in Egypt in the writer's day, still enforced today. Joseph's reforms outlived Joseph. Well, my third commentator is Walter Brueggemann, who is a little bit more in line with how I read the passage. Joseph's shrewdness shows that entering the world of the empire brings dangers with it. The Egyptian empire offers food and therefore life, but it is never far from exploitation, oppression, and slavery. As though to set the stage for the Exodus, the result of Joseph's tax reform is that citizens sell their persons to the throne. Contrast Leviticus 25. We'll get there in a second. They become bondservants and forfeit their freedom. Joseph may be credited with shrewdness, but for a tradition looking to the Exodus, it is a doubtful credit. You see what Brueggemann is saying here. We're in just a couple turns of the page in the Bible about to head into Exodus and hear about this oppressive system of Egyptian slavery and how the Israelites fall victim to it. It's hard to believe that we're supposed to feel unambiguous joy about what happens in this passage. We should probably have some doubts at least. Well, I think Brueggemann does a good job of pointing to some of the other Bible passages that help us figure out, okay, Sarna's making a point. He's like, this is not like the modern day. Possibly the narrative is looking at things in a different cultural context. Fine. So what does the Hebrew Bible actually have to say about this? What does the Old Testament actually have to say about this? What do we see in the Pentateuch itself? Well, let's see. Well, first of all, I just point to Exodus 22. I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. Egypt is continually referred to as the house of slavery. It was a place where Israel was held in bondage. Hard not to think that Genesis 47 isn't telling us that Joseph is a little bit complicit in that in some way. What's more, Leviticus 25 contemplates the exact situation Joseph finds himself in. If your brother who is with you becomes impoverished and he sells himself to you, you must not enslave him to the slavery of a slave. He must be as a wage laborer and as a sojourner. Until the year of Jubilee, he must serve with you. I put a question mark here because one of the interesting things about biblical Hebrew is we don't have a different word for slave and work or serve or servant or slave. It's all the same word. But clearly, I think this passage is pushing towards a distinction of the two ideas. Do you feel the emphasis in that first verse in 39? You shall not enslave him to the slavery of the slave. Almost like they're emphasizing something here. There is some kind of, if somebody has just become completely impoverished, there is some kind of wage laborer form of service using the same verb that they can do. But as it goes on to say, then at the year of Jubilee, so that's every 50 years, he will go out from with you, he and his children with him, and he will return to his family, and to the landholding of his fathers he will return. For they are my slaves, whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. They must not be sold in the sale of a slave. It's interesting. One of the books I was reading, a scholar named Diakonoff said everybody was somebody's slave in the ancient Near East. The idea that you would be nobody's slave is kind of not so much part of the cultural horizon. But what happens here in Leviticus is really interesting. They're saying, well, they're really God's slaves. The people of Israel are really God's slaves. And actually what that means is that no human being dare enslave. And that, I think that's rather striking here. And this whole passage is rather striking when we compare it with Genesis, because of course, we're trying to set up a system that's going to prevent exactly what happens in Genesis 47. Permanent, like long-term, centuries-long enslavement as a result of the hard conditions that come from poverty. Some kind of way in which they can work, but then ultimately gain their freedom. The last passage from the Old Testament I'll throw up here is 1 Samuel 8:15. And this story is when the people of Israel come and they want a king. And Samuel, ultimately God tells Samuel to respect their motives, will respect what they want, to give them a king. But before that, Samuel gives them a whole speech about, you don't want a king. Here are all the bad things about a king. And one of the things he mentions is, he will take 1/10 of your seed and your vineyards, and he will give it to his officials and his servants. Well, this is actually it's 1/10 rather than 20%, 1/5. But this whole thing sounds a lot like describing the way it works down in Egypt. And I could multiply examples. Certainly, you think of moments in Israel's history like where the power of kings became a problem. You think of Ahab and Jezebel framing Naboth in order to steal his vineyard. I think of Ezekiel's vision for the future, where the property of the king is very strictly delimited within certain boundaries outside of which it's not supposed to go. The idea that having a king and having this powerful structure presents some kind of danger towards them taking the land, taking away, enslaving the population is kind of an ever-present reality. And let me just throw one New Testament passage in there as well, which I think is the kind of New Testament echo and fulfillment of this idea of God's people not being sold into slavery. For freedom Christ has set us free. Therefore stand firm and do not become caught up again in the yoke of slavery. And that's kind of the culmination of this whole theme, right? For in Christ we're free, and Paul tells the Galatians, Paul, who loves to remind people that they ought to be gentle and submissive many, many times, nevertheless says in this case, it's a yoke of slavery. Don't get caught up in that. Don't be a slave. So I really have to look at that whole biblical trajectory and return to the passage of Genesis 47 and think we're not supposed to just be like, yes, Joseph, good job, well done. You were very clever. You did good work for Pharaoh and increased his land holdings. On the other hand, it's not a simple passage, is it? And I have some questions here that I'll go through, and then we can talk about them a bit more. How should we assess Joseph's individual actions? Could he have done something differently? And that's not a easy question, is it? I mean, Joseph literally saves everybody's life who lives in Egypt. They would all have died without him. That's not nothing. And furthermore, it's not like the grain is necessarily his to give away. It's Pharaoh's. I mean, it sounds like some kind of if we were going by the law of Moses, which of course Joseph couldn't have read, it wasn't written yet. If we're going by the law of Moses, we would maybe give the grain away or provide some kind of way for them to work for it on a limited period. But does Joseph have the ability to do that? I don't know. It's kind of what makes this narrative so complicated. To what extent can we capture what goes wrong here by focusing on individual actions and intentions? Is it possible that Joseph's intentions are perfectly good, but that there's something really dangerous about even trying to work out those good intentions within this power structure of Egypt, within this empire with Pharaoh at the top? Is it possible that even a freely agreed to deal, which I mean the Egyptians agree to it. I mean, their other option is starving to death. So I don't really think that that's that much of a apologetic and like that much of an argument in favor of what Joseph does. They don't really have. Do they really have a choice? Um, but is it possible that just being within that system creates forces that tend to push it towards injustice? Samuel seems to suggest that even having a king is dangerous in some way. So that's something to think about. And kind of like going to the next point, what is this passage teaching us about the connection between evil and power structures? Yeah. What do we, what are we supposed to glean from the fact that just being part of the power structure in Egypt, Joseph's function, even when he's trying to save lives, always ends up increasing the dominance of that power, and that leads to some pretty evil outcomes. Ultimately leads to Egypt becoming the house of slavery. Ultimately, in some way, Joseph's complicit in everything that happens to the Israelites after that. Like, he helped build the system that's going to enslave his people in 400 years' time. And finally, I mean, I think the upshot of all this, how can we act wisely when we find ourselves inside power structures that promote injustice? I think if there's one thing this passage implies, it is that word wisely, that like we could have great intentions, but if we're not wise, there are ways in which our attempts to help, attempts to do things that are good could end up getting flipped around towards consequences that actually do a lot of evil in the long run.